So welcome to this. This is actually the fourth public discussion hosted by Green Left during the course of 2022, or 2023 rather. And for those who do not know, Green Left is the eco-socialist tendency within the Green Party. We organise and advocate for eco-socialist perspectives in the development of Green Party policy and the development of Green Party campaigns. And in addition, we carry out a lot of outreach work, working with other sections of the eco-socialist left, both here in the UK and elsewhere globally. And if you're interested in finding out more about Green Left, there will be information posted in the chat now at the start of this meeting and once again at the end. And we're always anxious to hear from new members or prospective new members who would like to join us in our work. Now, this evening, our topic, as you will have seen from the advertisements, is Israel, Palestine, Gaza. What should Greens be saying? And I think everyone appreciates that this is a topic upon which the views are held with enormous passion. And we know that there is a great tradition in the Green Party of having attunement, or many of us will appreciate this, at the start of each meeting. And normally in Green Left, we do not observe that convention. But on this particular occasion, I am going to ask that before we start, we take the opportunity of a few moments of silent reflection to clear our minds and to prepare ourselves for what I trust will be a respectful discussion. So if everyone please could go on mute, and we'll observe a few moments of silence, and I shall get things started again very shortly. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm now going to just deal with a few housekeeping items before we get to the main part of the meeting. First of all, as we've already said, if anyone joins with a device name or a telephone number in your Zoom window, please change that to a recognisable human name. And if you're unable to do that using Zoom, send a message in the chat to Pete, our host, and Pete will be able to do it for you. Secondly, unless I have called you to speak, please stay on mute at all times in order to minimise the extraneous noise and noise interference. We've already had a couple of illustrations of how that can disrupt things. And when we get to the open part of the meeting, if you do want to speak, please raise your Zoom hand, and that will force you to prominence on my screen, and I'll be able to see that you've indicated a wish to speak. If you are unable, for whatever reason, to raise your Zoom hand, once again, please use the chat. Please contact Pete Murray in the chat. He's our host, and we'll try to sort something out. Pete will liaise with me and try to alert me to the fact that you wish to speak. If you are called to speak, please switch your camera on. This is an important accessibility question, particularly for the hearing impaired. You can, of course, switch it back off once you've finished speaking. It goes without saying, please do not speak over someone else. And once again, please let us all act with respect towards all others during the meeting, and let us strive collectively to make sure that this is a safe space for everyone. So, this is this evening's discussion meeting. It is an opportunity principally to hear a range of views. It is, of course, an opportunity to express one's own view, And collectively, it's an opportunity for us to educate ourselves and to foster solidarity around this key issue. And to kick us off this evening, we have 4 guest speakers, each of whom will speak for up to 10 minutes. And after that, we shall open it up for general discussion and questions. And our speakers, in the order in which I'm proposing to take them this evening, will be, first of all, Neligan, of Greens for Palestine. We are getting some extraneous noise there, and I'm just looking on my screen to see where that's coming from. It's not immediately apparent. So Neligan of Greens for Palestine, followed by Carne, who is the Green Party's spokesperson on global solidarity. And then third, we shall hear from Alexi Dimond. Alexi is a councillor in Sheffield who played a key role in securing the passage of a groundbreaking motion on Sheffield Council on this topic. And then finally, we shall hear from Peter Allen of Green Left. And so, to start things off, our speaker contributions off, I'm going to hand over first of all to Neligan. So, Annie, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Danny, and thanks enormously to Green Left, because this is a tumultuous, painful, excruciating, enormous time. I think the world's not going to be quite the same after this, and I think this opportunity to figure out what the Green Party's role can be in trying to move forward from this such painful place is really important. I welcome the Green Party statements that have been made since October the 7th, which have primarily called for a ceasefire, have regretted the loss of life and limb to both Israelis and Palestinians, calling for the relief of hostages, an end to arming Israel, and particularly an urgent and vigorous international effort to bring a resolution. I welcome, it's great that Alexi's here, because I think we can welcome the Green Party councillors. I'm really sorry, that's my phone, I'll just shut the door. Councillors doing the hard work of trying to get these effective resolutions through local councils. It's hard, it's difficult, it's tedious, and it really, really matters. But we also need to go on beyond that to thinking about what next, and how the Green Party can be a part of that international urgent and vigorous effort that our leaders have spoken of. So I'll just follow the brief, not got long. First of all, the two-state solution. This has been referred to in a Green Party statement, and I really hope we spend no time at all this evening basing this, discussing this, absorbing though the topic can be. Why not? First of all, it's not our job. It's for the participants to decide based on their needs. The Israelis and Palestinians, when the time is right, will be looking at their capacity, their priorities, what democratic support they have. And Green Party policy has always been clear on that since it was originally introduced. The solution may be achieved in one state or two within the former Palestine mandate, is the wording on our original policy. And I think it really matters. Particularly, I think it matters when I get yet another letter back from my Tory MP saying that he supports the two-state solution. And I think that what he means is that he wants me to think that Palestinians have some rights, but he's not going to put any effort into thinking about how that might come about. I think the other reason not to spend time talking about it is that the arguments for each side for a one-state solution or a two-state solution are mostly about why the other one doesn't work. And that's right, because where we are, neither of them are going to work. I was thinking it reminds me we could spend in the Green Party time thinking about who's going to have what post in the cabinet when the Green Party takes over government. But so much has got to happen before that's realistic. And that's where we need to put our energy into what we need to do. Because for the Palestinians to play a part in determining their future, it means dismantling the exclusionist, expansionist basis of the Israeli state and the institutions that support it. Until that happens, the Israeli government has no interest in respecting the rights of the Palestinians, and we have to find ways of putting enough pressure on them, or being part of putting enough pressure on them, to bring them to the table where the negotiations can take place. That's what I think about that. How can we contribute to this, the said realigning of the forces that would take part in discussions? Well, primarily, our position has been and is and will be around support for the BDS movement. Now, my hope is that in the enormous blossoming of awareness of the injustice that's been carried out on Palestinians for so long, the huge international response there's been, I don't think we have any conception living in Britain and being exposed and confined by our media of how big the global response has been. And I think this is the time when the BDS movement could really begin to move. It may seem very long term, it may seem very gradual, the ceasefire clearly matters at the moment, but I think it really matters that we're building on that. Just to remind ourselves, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, it's a call to the international community to pressurise Israel diplomatically, politically, economically, culturally, to come to negotiations in terms of respect for Palestinian aspirations, whether those are in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Israel, or in the camps. I'm proud that the Green Party has had a policy. I'm getting something going on here. Is that to do with me or to do with somebody else?
No, I'm sorry. Could I just intervene? We have a new joiner called Paul's iPhone 2 who is not on mute, and we're getting some background noise. So Paul, whose iPhone? Thank you, Paul. Please go on, Annie.
Right. Okay, thanks. Again, I'm proud that the Green Party has had a policy of support for the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement since 2014. We can't overestimate its importance. It's the one tool, the one non-violent, civil supported tool that the Palestinians have, but it puts the responsibility on us. And I think that if we look back at the policy, and I think I won't take the time to look at it on screen, but I can give you the reference to it for anybody who wants to. But our policy calls on Green Party members and Green Party elected representatives to ensure that the underlying causes are addressed. This is the causes of the conflict between Palestinians and Israel, acknowledging that there can be no lasting peace without justice, to support these calls by active participation in the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign. And I think that is a clue to one of the things I want to say tonight, which is it's not just about what we say, it's not just about what we advocate, it is also about what we do. So how can we make this participation more active? I think our membership must have an enormously new appreciation of what's been going on for Palestinians these past years. And I think that we should be able to use our strengths and opportunities as a political party rather than as a campaigning group, and think, what are our strengths? What are opportunities do we have from where we are? There's our elected representatives who can be pressing for government sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, the freezing of assets, the kind of tools that have been used to more or less effect against Russia. There's work that local councils can do. Some of you will historically remember the work that was done on procurement policies of local councils, so that big companies like Veolia and G4S, who were working in Israel and implementing the policy of occupation, lost contracts. The current focus for that is on JCB and Hewlett Packard, who I'm sure councils have involvement with. There's been a shift from where the from procurement to looking at where the local authority funds and pension funds are invested, and a few determined brave councillors have already taken up this issue, looking at where the council funds are invested, getting through divestment policies from their councils. I think the Green Party can offer these councillors leadership, encouragement, support, to share good practice, find out what works, get in contact with other with other councillors. I think Alexi will be able to fill us in perhaps on what would make a difference to them, what would have made a difference to them in what they've been doing. We in the membership can act as members. We're members of pension funds, trade unions, universities. We can all be thinking about the organisations that we're involved with and how far they could be part of the BDS campaign. I think for that we need education of members so we can all feel confident in arguing. We need communication, articles in Green News, briefings, letters, statements, everything, to banging on about it, making sure that we're all aware of what the possibilities are as well as the opportunities. I think for this we need to look at the communication system in the Green Party, because I think that our capacity to support councillors and members isn't working as well as it could. I think the BDS group could have been used much more as a resource than it has. They've produced briefing papers on the issue of boycott and need support in disseminating the resources and accessing the membership. So I think there's an opening up needed of the Green Party to allow us to weave these policies into our practice. There's also international...
You're now 1 minute remaining, I think.
Oh my goodness, okay. In that case, I shall just not even attempt perhaps to... I think there's other things we need to do around the issue of conflating anti-Semitism with opposing Israel. We need to be challenging real anti-Semitism in our campaigning work. We need to support initiatives in Palestine and in Israel with peace and justice groups there. We can make partnerships with groups in this country, things like Campaign Against the Arm Trade. And there's a huge opportunity to make links between the climate justice and international justice campaigns, which links that are already being made, and I think we could be instrumental for. So I look forward to hearing from other speakers what suggestions they've got, and from suggestions from the floor. But most of all, I do want to finish by saying that if we, along with other progressive forces in the international community, had taken up the BDS campaign over the last nearly 10 years since we first affiliated, that it's possible that tens of thousands of Palestinians and thousands of Israelis would still be alive today, and every day that we let pass it has this intolerable result. I think the repercussions of the massacre are going to be long-lived and widespread, and that to have a future, the Green Party needs to be finding itself an effective, active role. The end.
Thank you very much indeed, Annie. Yeah, I'm sorry to bring things to a close. I did add on a few extra seconds to allow for the little interruption there, but we do have to keep fairly strictly to time, because we have 30 odd people in the room, probably many of whom will wish they have an opportunity to speak at some point. Thank you much. A lot of very thought-provoking material there, and useful background on the BDS campaign also. Thank you very much for that. Now, our second speaker, as I mentioned at the start, is Carne Ross. Carne is the Green Party's spokesperson on global solidarity. So I shall hand over now to Carne. Carne, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you, Danny, and thanks for arranging this meeting. I appreciate the invitation to attend. I want to emphasize that I'm above all here to listen. I really want to learn what concerned members of the Green Party think about the terrible situation in Israel, Palestine, and Gaza in particular, and reflect on what I hear, and also feed those into the leadership group that I'm part of that works on what the party says about the crisis. I was heavily involved, for instance, in the drafting of all of the statements that the party has made about the issue. So it's really important that I understand what people are saying about it, what opinions are about it, where we're getting it wrong, and what we might say in future. Let me just set out a little bit where I'm coming from when I address the issue. I should say I've got some personal background on this. When I was a British diplomat, I was head of the Arab-Israel section of the Near East North Africa Department in the Foreign Office, which dealt with Israel-Palestine, what was then called the Middle East Peace Process. And I later became the head of Middle East policy at the UK mission to the UN, dealing with Palestine as well as Iraq and other issues on the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. So I have some history on this contested issue. And that also helps me with some of the sort of fundamentals of the Green Party position on this, which is framed by three things really: international law, the requirement for the respect of human rights, and the protection of civilians. And those are the kind of three vectors which inform our immediate response to what's going on. There's also international law as particularly it applies to Palestine. So I'm thinking, for instance, of UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338, which demand the end of occupation from the occupied territories of West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and the right of return, etc., etc. But also the Geneva Conventions as they apply to the duties of the occupying power in the occupied territories and Gaza, despite the fact that Israel left Gaza in 2015, I think it was. Israel is still regarded legally as being in occupation of the Gaza Strip. Other relevant frameworks that we think about are international humanitarian law, the laws of war, the Rome Statute, for instance, the Geneva Conventions. And on that basis, that has led us to say, for instance, that we believe Israel is breaching the laws of war in three respects: indiscriminate killing, disproportionate killing, and the forced displacement of the population from northern to southern Gaza, and the collective punishment of the population of Gaza by the denial of food, fuel, medical supplies, humanitarian supplies, etc. So in those three regards, we believe that Israel is in breach of international humanitarian law. So you can see from all of that framework why we came to the conclusion fairly early on to call for a ceasefire. I was just looking back at the statements and I see that as early as the 8th or 9th of October, we were calling for an end to the violence, by which we meant an end to Hamas violence, but also Israel's violence against Gaza. And that has been the position we've hewed to ever since, emphatically calling for a ceasefire. Of course, a ceasefire that applies to all parties, in case anyone's in any doubt. We are the only English political party that has called for a ceasefire to date. Of course, the Labour Party, as well as the Conservatives, are not calling for a ceasefire. Plaid Cymru in Wales and the Scottish Nationalists in Scotland have also called for a ceasefire. So we're not the only British political party to call for a ceasefire. We are the only English political party. There are some other elements of our position which are also really important. The first is absolutely emphatic condemnation of the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October, without equivocation and without reservation. We have condemned those attacks as barbaric, and that will continue to be our position. And I think when we're making public statements, it's important to say that. It's not necessarily popular to say that, but I think it is important to say that because that is what we believe. It's not a position taken, to strike any kind of spurious balance between in our position between Israel and the Palestinians, but actually a position derived out of our respect for international law and humanitarian norms. The second thing that's important to emphasize in our position is that we call for the release of hostages, the unconditional release of hostages. So we don't in any way endorse Hamas's policy of trading for hostages. We think hostage taking is wrong. Though on the other hand, we have also welcomed the release of hostages by Israel. We have used that word in regard to Palestinian prisoners held in Israel, a large percentage of whom were in so-called administrative detention, held without charge by Israel. Of course, this position that we've taken throws up a lot of criticism, a lot of questions. I'll try to deal with some of the typical ones. The first is, how do you deal with Hamas? How do you address the fact that they committed these barbaric attacks? Surely there's only a military solution to this. And what we say, of course, is that we believe there is only a political solution to the Israel-Palestine situation. There is no military solution. A military solution will only, in fact, make things worse. Israel's attack on Gaza are a recruiting sergeant for Hamas and other extremist groups. History has demonstrated that from other incursions by Israel into Gaza have not achieved peace between Israel and Palestine, nor security for Israel. Secondly, the criticism is Hamas won't negotiate. How can you call for a political solution with a party that won't negotiate? To which we would respond, Hamas is already negotiating with Israel for the release of hostages. So it clearly demonstrates they are ready to negotiate when it's in their interest to do so. But I have to say, personally speaking, I have some sympathy with those who say we need a change of leadership on both the Palestinian and the Israeli sides. This isn't part of the Green Party policy, but it's something I personally believe that, you know, with extremists in power in Jerusalem for the Israelis and extremists in power in Hamas, it doesn't look like a very propitious environment for any kind of peace process. Another criticism we receive is that we are singling out Israel for criticism and that we haven't criticized other situations of gross human rights abuses, conflict. Well, if you look at our statements, we have indeed made statements about human rights abuses in places like Saudi Arabia, North Korea, the conflict in Syria. If you look at my Twitter feed, which is one place to follow Green Party statements about the world, you'll see plenty of criticism of those places, I think amply refuting the allegation that we are in some way singling out Israel for unfair and special attention. And a point about the situation in Britain itself, the leaders have been very clear that they want to do what they can to reach out in their own communities and nationally to Jewish and Muslim communities in the face of the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and they have been active in doing that. And I think that's another very important plank of our policy. What's on my mind is, what do we do? What do we say as the situation continues? Clearly, the killing is not going to stop anytime soon. We're looking at the possible removal of the Palestinian population from Gaza in its entirety, the ethnic cleansing of the population from Gaza. How do we respond to that? We're looking at
1 minute.
The likelihood of continued Israeli occupation of Gaza for the foreseeable future, and who knows what will happen to the hostages. So these are the kinds of issues that I'm beginning to think about, and where we will need to make a response in the eventuality that they take place. But as I say, I'm here to listen. I look forward to your questions. I'm happy to answer anything I can about how we come to these positions that we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carne. And now we move on to our third speaker. And as I said at the beginning of this section, our third speaker is Alexi Dimond. Alexi is a Green councillor representing the Green Party and constituents in Sheffield, who has worked on the passage of a motion dealing with this issue on the council where they sit. So for the next 10 minutes, please, Alexi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Danny. So yeah, my name is Alexi Dimond. I'm a councillor in Sheffield in a ward called Gleadless Valley. I was elected in 2021. I'd just like to thank everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming and for the work that you've been doing. I've agreed with what Annie said, and Carne, I think the statements that you've put out with the party leadership have been really impressive and with a clear moral position. I think it's stood us in differentiated us from the other parties in England who have really abandoned all sort of moral authority. I mean, for the last 2 months, we've seen the worst atrocities that I've ever seen in my lifetime. You know, the rate of killing in Gaza is far higher than in other conflicts which I've seen in my lifetime, such as Syria, Bosnia, Iraq, and these were catastrophic conflicts, but especially the rate that children have been killed. And the other difference for me has been the clear and explicit genocidal intent that has been stated clearly by Israeli politicians, but really have been ignored by the media and the leadership of the other parties. There's no recognition of those statements. The allusion to biblical stories like Amalek, the justification of withholding food and water. The clear statement they're going to level Gaza and there'll be nothing left whatsoever, and then to actually do that and just watch and do nothing and just be in denial. I think it was quite clear from early on that this was going to be an attempted genocide. I read a really powerful article by Rasjd Khalidi, who is an international expert on genocide, called The Textbook Case of Genocide, and I would really encourage everyone to read this. I think one of the reasons that this is being allowed to happen is the legacy of colonialism in the UK and of course America as well, and the historic dehumanization of Palestinian people that has been going on for years. You can read statements from Churchill, and going back, of course, to the Balfour Declaration. These racism and colonial attitudes towards not only Palestinian people but also Jewish people has been a clear part of British discourse, especially the governments and various politicians going back. I think this is a legacy of that. I mean, the media always ignore the history of what has happened in Palestine. They ignore colonial dispossession, the ethnic cleansing, the colonialism, the apartheid system that has existed for a long time and has just been getting worse and worse. I think everyone, if they haven't read the report by Amnesty International that came out in January 2022, should read that. And it's clear that there won't be a resolution. Neither the Palestinian people or the Israeli people will be free without the end of this apartheid system and a system of a supremacy of one group of people over another group of people. I think another thing that's been clear is that the media has been ignoring atrocities that have happened in the West Bank, prior to October the 7th and also after October the 7th. We've seen hundreds of Palestinians killed in the West Bank since October 7th, where of course Hamas isn't in operation, including lots of children. I think Carne, you touched on the hostages. I would argue that, well, if we talk about the hostages that Israel released in exchanges, they've kidnapped the same amount of or more people than they've released during that time, and with really no recognition of this again in the media or from mainstream politicians. So I think really we need to really be calling out not only for a ceasefire, but an end to the UK government's complicity in what is happening in Gaza at the moment, but also generally in Israel and the occupied territories. I agree with Annie in that we need to be making clear calls to end arms sales. We also need to be asking questions about what is happening from the bases in Cyprus, the sovereign base areas in Cyprus, because actually Israel could not carry out these atrocities and this genocidal campaign without the constant refueling, the rearmament that the Americans are providing them. So actually, this is really an American genocide and a British and American Israeli joint endeavour. And of course, as we saw at the UN, it is only America that is blocking a ceasefire, or the US. Just to say a bit about how we managed to pass the motion in Sheffield at the full council. I think one of the reasons that this was achieved was because of the huge pressure that the people of Sheffield put on local politicians. But it was also something of an accident in that Sheffield Green Party councillors only have 4 motions a year, and it just happened that we had our motion. It was the first motion of the month of the meeting, and of course nobody else was going to bring this to the meeting, but because we could bring that to the meeting as one of our 4 motions a year. Also, because of the weakness of the Labour Party in Sheffield, they were in a position where I think they just had to support the motion for a ceasefire. And it is important to remember that the motion was called stopping genocide in Gaza. So we recognise straight away, and I made reference to the statements that had been made already at that time. We actually got the council to condemn Keir Starmer for his comments in support of withholding food and water from the people of Gaza. But again, it was a position. Labour did vote for the motion. They voted against certain things, including that condemnation of Keir Starmer, but that passed with the support of Lib Dem and other councillors. And whereas in other places Labour councillors haven't had the licence to oppose a ceasefire, in Sheffield, because they've become they've only narrowly the biggest group in Sheffield, and there's a substantial number of Muslim Labour councillors who actually had put out their own statement calling for a ceasefire prior to the meeting. I think they felt under pressure that if they didn't support the ceasefire, then those councillors might resign or leave the party, as has happened in some other councils, notably Oxford. And again, I can't emphasise enough the immense pressure from the people of Sheffield, who contacted councillors, contacted MPs, demonstrated, and even during the council meeting, we had a 3-hour rally outside of the council meeting that was demanding a ceasefire. So I mean, the extent of organising, does go on. I think another thing is that in Sheffield, we supported prior to this, much earlier in the year, might have even been January, Sheffield Green Party unanimously agreed to affiliate with the Sheffield Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, and reaffirm support for boycott, divestment and sanctions. I think there's a lot of other actions that we can take as councillors and putting pressure on, but I'm sure we'll discuss that later in the meeting.
Thank you very much indeed, Alexi. Spot on the 10 minutes there. Excellently done. And lots of food for thought, I think, for Green Party members who similarly find themselves in locations with perhaps Labour groups on local authorities that are not currently at their strongest, and where there may be some pressure points where we could strategically apply some pressure. Moving on to our final speaker, I'm going to introduce Peter Allen, who is a member of Green Left, the organisation that is hosting this evening's meeting. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Pete. The floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be back in the Green Party and in Green Left after a near 6-year absence. But I'm not speaking today on behalf of Green Left. I'm not a member of the committee. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Green Party International Committee, which I've recently been elected to, which doesn't actually make policy, but actually focuses on building a good improving links with Greens across the globe. So just to make that clear. I was considering doing a fancy slideshow with lots of graphics and stuff, but I thought rather than do that, some people might like to see me after all of this time, 6 years older and hopefully 6 years wiser. So hello to everybody. The situation is truly horrific, isn't it? It's truly horrific. Hell on earth, as fittingly described by the leader of the UN today. Hell on earth, it certainly is. Jeremy Bowen, a BBC correspondent who's seen quite a few wars in the Middle East, compared it, said the destruction of Gaza was now pretty much on a par with the destruction of Aleppo by the Assad regime, supported by the Russians, of course. And I'm actually surely not the only one who's cried. I've cried watching the coverage. I cried last night when on my local news in a South Manchester Palestinian had basically got news that several of his family members had been killed. He'd shut his takeaway immediately, and was in a hell of a state. And as I say, it does drive you to tears. And it's actually very hard for someone like me, who for 45 years of political activity has very strongly asserted the right of Israel to exist. And that's always been my position. And although it's clearly obviously not as hard for me as it is for the people of Gaza, and also, to be honest, for the bereaved Israelis, many of whose loved ones were actually, in some cases, active supporters of the Palestinians, living close to the border and choosing to interact to the extent that they could, and that's actually again part of the tragedy. And I agree with the Green Party's position on response to the crisis. I think it's been excellent, and I think there's a general agreement tonight on that amongst the speakers at least, and well done for being so coherent. Let's talk about the future, and I want to talk about the future, but maybe we need to talk a bit about the past. As many have said, this conflict didn't start on October the 7th. It didn't start in 1967 even, or even in 1948. Doesn't even go back. It even goes back. The root causes of the conflict actually go back well before 1917 and the Balfour Declaration, and basically it has an awful lot to do with hundreds of years of terrible anti-Semitism, which obviously ended in the Holocaust. And I think we need to bear that in mind, and as I'm sure we do. There's an interview that I'd recommend with somebody called Rasjd Khalidi, who was a member of the Palestinian delegation in the Oslo peace talks. It's an interview with Ash Sarkar on YouTube, and I'll send a link to it. And I'll send some links to that and other things that I've found of interest that maybe Pete can pass on to everybody who's present tonight. And I'd well recommend looking at that interview, looking at that video particularly. Rasjd describes Palestinians as being victims of victims, and I think that's actually a good way of putting it. He's written a long book which I haven't read. I would recommend Ian Black's book, Enemies and Neighbours, for an account of basically the sorry history of Israel-Palestine since 1917 at least. A former Guardian correspondent who recently died and hasn't lived to see the resolution of the conflict. And I think one of the things that Ian says is that the Palestinians haven't actually been very well led by their leaders and haven't been well served by their Arab neighbours, and I would agree with that. Arab neighbours who periodically make deals with Israel behind the backs of the Palestinians, whilst themselves excluding Palestinian refugees from citizenship, and periodically actually declaring war on them and expelling them bombing them, as has happened in Jordan and subsequently in Syria. The verdict on Yasser Arafat perhaps is probably mixed, but at least he can be given credit for demanding agency for the Palestinians themselves. Although many would say he wasn't very good at practicing democracy, but nevertheless, we haven't got, credit where credit's due. We haven't got time to go through the whole history of the 75 plus years, but perhaps I would like to focus on one important period or one important moment. The Oslo peace talks, which didn't actually take place in Oslo, appeared to offer the prospect of some kind of long-term peace. But they were undermined by what some people would call extremists on both sides, Israeli settlers and terrorists and Hamas terrorists, culminating in the assassination of Rabin in 1995 by a Jewish extremist, and the subsequent election that brought to power Netanyahu for the first time. And it was an election, apparently, that the Palestinian communities, and some Palestinians have the vote in Israel, boycotted the election, and it made the difference between between Labour staying in office, a Labour-led government staying in office, or Netanyahu coming to power. And I'm sure that there was good reason for the boycott, but I think with the benefit of hindsight, it was tragic. That's a tragedy, nevertheless. Is there any hope? Israeli politics doesn't really seem to offer any at the moment, with the so-called left seemingly in huge decline. I'm probably not the only one. We'll probably all agree that what we want is PR in the UK, but it hasn't possibly served the people of Israel and Palestine well, because tiny extremist religious and nationalist parties have had a hold on government on the basis of a tiny percentage of the vote. But let's leave that aside. I checked out the Israeli Greens, and they don't seem to. They don't even seem to comment on the war. It's as if the war wasn't taking place, as if the conflict wasn't taking place. They focus on environment issues, etc., etc. But the Israel-Palestine conflict is not even mentioned. I don't know what the status of the Israeli Greens is. I noticed that they're not part of the global Green movement. And of course, Netanyahu is boosted by the support of recent immigrants from Eastern Europe and from North Africa. Apparently, that's a huge part of his electoral base. So the whole thing is a tragedy and actually pretty complicated. Is a two-state, but he's in trouble, of course. He is in trouble, of course. There's reports that he basically ignored security advice and actually, which was warning him that the attack was about to happen, and basically is also been accused of funding Hamas in order to divide the Palestinian movement. And good. Let's hope that this conflict sees the back of him anyway. And what else? There's not much opposition in Israel amongst the Jewish population, it seems, although there are crumbs of comfort. And I did stick something from Standing Together, which is a Jewish Palestinian network which is trying to bring the two sides together. And I've put a link to a Zoom meeting that they're holding on Sunday night, and I've stuck that on the Green Left site if anybody wants to see it. Okay, and I was encouraged by a letter in the New York Times today from peace groups, from charity groups calling on the Americans to take a much stronger stand. Let me just finish, and I'm probably going to go over my time. Let me just finish by saying two things. The Green Party is obviously against war for its own sake, but we're also against war because it's environmentally very destructive. I've read that 5% of total carbon emissions are actually caused by militaries, and I've seen that there's a claim that that the Ukraine war, that's the first 12 months of the Ukraine war, used the same emissions as a country the size of Belgium during a whole year. So it's another reason for opposing militarism. And finally, let me just let me just plug something. I want to talk to you about a book that I recently read, which isn't directly related to the struggle, but actually it blew me away anyway, and I would strongly recommend people to read it. It's called Nomad Century. It's by Gaia Vince, and she basically talks about how global warming is going to lead to a need for a mass migration of people from the global south to the global north. She actually says that lots of cities, most of the biggest cities in the world, will be uninhabitable by the year 2100, and that those in cities include Cairo as well, which is obviously just slightly south of Israel, Palestine. So if her analysis is correct, then the reconstruction of Gaza, given its location, and indeed the propping up of the Israeli state, makes no sense. So I'll leave you there.
Thank you, Pete. Suitably ominous note to finish on there. Okay, so we have heard from each of our four speakers in turn. What we're going to do now is open it up for points and questions. From time to time, I may come back to the speakers and give them an opportunity, if it's appropriate, to address questions or respond to particular points. We'll see how the discussion goes. And as I said before, if you would like to speak, the thing to do is to use your Zoom hand. If you go to the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on that, there will be an option there to raise your Zoom hand. Please raise your Zoom hand rather than your physical hand, because if you're on page 2 of my screen, I won't see you waving your hand there in your living room or wherever you are, but your Zoom hand will force you to the top of my screen. And if you can't use your Zoom hand, please send a message to the host in the chat. And please can I entreat everyone to keep their contributions brief and to the point. And before the end, when we're scheduled to wind up at 9 o'clock, we'll come back to our speakers and give each of them a few minutes for closing remarks. So already I have hands from in order. Faiz, Les, Ben and Roy. So we're going to take them in that order. Please, if people can voluntarily limit themselves to 2 or 3 minutes, that would be great. I understand that that will not always be possible, but I'm inviting you to enter into the spirit of this in order that everyone gets a chance. So over to you, please, Faiz.
Yep. Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm from the West Central Green Party, West Central London. I had 3 suggestions. One is we have very clear evidence of genocidal rhetoric from the top of the Israeli leadership, from the president, from the Minister of Defense, from the Minister of National Security. Is there can we start a campaign to make sure that these people are put on some sort of sanctions list, like what was done to Pinochet? And because these are not random backbenchers, they are actually dictating how the war is conducted by Israel. So that was one comment. Second, I am very worried about there's already a campaign to target violent settlers. I think that should be expanded. I'm very worried about people going to live in settlements, children being indoctrinated into a society which is a forceful intrusion on Palestinian land, maintained by force of arms, based on an ideology which places their rights as superior to the locals. It's against international law, and I would like them and people who serve in the Israeli Defense Forces to be monitored under the prevent legislation that we've had in place for a number of years. So that was 2. And the third thing I'd like to say is there has been a huge attempt at stifling debate and discussions in our universities, in our schools, in our academic institutions, where any expression of Palestinian solidarity is cracked down by authorities, by whispering campaigns, by threats and cancellations. And what can we do about making sure that criticizing Israel is considered a legitimate expression, especially when we see them bombing civilians on a daily basis. Sorry, thank you for that.
Thank you, Faiz. And if everyone could take Faiz's contribution as an exemplar of how to be clear and precise and concise and succinct, I'm sure we'll have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much indeed, Faiz. Next we have Les, and then, as I say, Roy and Paul. So Les next, please.
Okay, thanks. I want to pose two questions, which I hope the speakers will answer among all the other questions. One is, I mean, this comes from the previous comment. One is, what is the driver for the Israeli regime? And therefore, what might count as a solution? And second, what can Green Party members do that might make a practical difference beyond simply saying what we oppose or support? So on the first question, it's totally false to say that the Israeli regime was a response to anti-Semitism. The whole Zionist movement was founded by those Jews who were relatively privileged. They were least affected by anti-Semitism. The Zionist movement and the foundation of Israel was overwhelmingly opposed by the vast majority of Jews who were more oppressed, especially those in Eastern Europe. An alternative explanation, which I think is better for leading to a solution, is that the Zionist project was a perverse Jewish form of white settler colonialism. It's modeled after European colonialism, which dispossessed, killed, and eliminated the indigenous people. That's the only way we can understand the whole history of the Zionist project from the 1948 Nakba, 67 invasion, and now the genocide. It's the logical continuation of that settler colonial racist project. So I leave that question for the speakers to say, what do you think is the source of the conflict as a basis for a possible solution? And the second, how can Green Party members be effective, making a practical difference? I mean, it's okay to say what we think should happen or shouldn't happen, meaning what should or shouldn't be done by other people. But, citing international law, calling on governments to do this or that will make no difference whatsoever. Those statements can inspire people to take potentially effective action, and especially around the BDS campaign. So exactly how should we mobilize people to support the BDS campaign to be effective? For example, as regards the arms trade, the only effective action in all this time has been the sabotage of Elbit Systems facilities around the country, and now more recently the blockade of arms factories by trade union activists. Another front would be complicit investments of local authorities and university pension funds. I mean, those campaigns have been spearheaded by key activists, including many in the Green Party. So that should be highlighted and promoted in local authorities all over the country. So I'd like the speakers to say, what can we do that would make a practical effect beyond simply statements? So I stop there.
Thank you very much, Les. So two fairly clear questions. What I'm going to do is take another speaker or two. We'll see how the time goes and come back to our speakers and ask for their observations on that. So Les is posing two questions. He asks, what is the driver for the Israeli regime? And he's questioning historical assumptions, principally because he sees an analysis of that as a way of getting at the conditions for a solution. And secondly, he's asking, how can Green Party members go beyond making statements which have some degree of effect, but are more performative perhaps sometimes than practical, and is there something practical we could do? So we'll give speakers a few minutes to reflect on that, and in the meantime we'll go to our next floor contribution, which comes from Roy. Roy, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, really good meeting. Couple points for me, really. I'm really quite sympathetic to the idea of two states, probably not in a way that the Americans and the and the British see it, British government sees it, because I'm looking at situations like Kosovo in the Balkans and even Northern Ireland, that there were ways forward, possibly diplomatically. Having said that, my position is we've got to look as eco-socialists to what workers are doing to fight against the Israeli government, but also in Palestine and in the Middle East itself, because that's only the solution. The only way forward is a socialist Middle East and a socialist world, because frankly, capitalism it doesn't work. It destroys. Israel was established primarily by the attempt to control the divine of all people in the Middle East, and we know that because the British historically have done the same thing as well. That's what capitalism does. They try to promote disunity, whilst as socialists we promote unity. We argue for people to work together. So I'd like 2 points really, but I want to expand this issue on the two-state scenario, diplomatic piece, but also what eco-socialists should be saying as well.
Thank you, Roy. So if Roy and Les, if you both pop your hands down now, so save me getting confused about what's a current hand and what's a legacy hand. And we'll go now to Paul and then Ben, and then we'll come back to our speakers. So Paul, please.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, to the previous speakers, one said, I think it was Les, what was the driver of the Israelis? I think it's quite clear. The Zionists Likud, the driver has been before and always will be a greater Israel. They want to make sure that they have a greater Israel. There's no doubt in my mind about that, nor reading their comments over the years leads us to that conclusion. Another speaker, I'm afraid I didn't write down the name, mentioned the Oslo Accord. And we have to be absolutely clear. The Oslo Accord offered the Palestinians nothing except the Palestinian Authority, which was then immediately undermined. There was no suggestion of any road to a two-state solution. That's why they had to have Oslo II, and that didn't lead to it either. Getting back to Hamas, which is the current reason why most of these meetings are taking place. I'm no defender of terrorism of any form, whether it be the IRA, whether it be Hamas, or whether it be the Zionists under Menachem Begin and other people who were terrorists. And no one would negotiate with Menachem Begin until he became the elected Prime Minister of Israel. And then quite properly, the British government, instead of banning him from this country, said, well, you've been elected, we're going to talk to you. The same principles did not apply to Hamas when they were elected in 2006, when there was the opportunity under Abbas as the president, when they reached an accommodation with the PLO to form a joint government briefly, to negotiate. But what did the West do? What did Israel do? They boycotted that government. They boycotted the two territories, and they cut off the funding. So let's be clear. Likud in particular, Netanyahu in particular, Sharon in particular, and other leaders, and now you've got this other guy, his name Gavir, can't remember his name, sorry, of an even more right-wing party who's in the Knesset. They have never, ever accepted a two-state solution. Never have, and they never will, which is why they built the settlements and continue to expand the settlements. And until we get it clear that Hamas could have been negotiated with several times, probably can't at the moment because of what's just happened. But again, if they are elected, they're the people who will be speaking for the people who elected them, and they should be negotiated with. This idea that we never negotiate with terrorists is well worn out and continually over the years, in the end we have, the IRA being the latest one in the UK, obviously. So if we're going to talk about Hamas, please read the history of the number of times I think they had a one-year unilateral truce at one stage that wasn't reciprocated by the Israelis. They have it from time to time, while saying, because they've got different wings within their grouping, I'm sure, while saying they never recognize Israel. In the end, I think it was about 2012, something like that, they actually changed their charter, which didn't precisely say they'd recognize Israel, but said they would, I think, offer the 10-year truce, was it, in order to build a two-state basically solution. What they've always said is they want the UN Charter. Simple as that, sorry, the UN resolution. They've always said, give us back the prisoners, give us back the right to return, give us freedom to go to be part of Jerusalem, and give us a two-state solution without settlement. They were the basis of negotiations, but no one has ever once tried to negotiate with Hamas except when they've taken prisoners, and that's the sad fact of life.
Thank you, Paul. And finally, before we come back to our speakers, and when we do, I think we'll ask them to comment on any points they may wish to pick up on, including Les's 2 questions. So if we go in reverse order this time, just because it's easy for me to manage things that way. So we would go to Pete, and then to Alexi, and then to Carne, and then to Annie. But we shall do that after Ben. And Paul, in the interim, if you could pop your hand down, that would help me keep track of things. Ben, please.
Hello, my name is Ben Samuel, Barnet Green Party. I've obviously pushed within my local party and groups which I have influence on this issue. I don't disagree with what you're saying before, but I think what we've been saying through our spokesperson and through the leadership has been very clear in the media. The only funny thing was that thing about the hostages, because usually they're referred to as prisoners, administrative detention, all this stuff, but that hasn't been a problem. So, for instance, if our leadership started to talk about strong language like we can't, language which sounds quite violent, when if you're in a negotiating situation, you're drawing red lines left, right, and centre. We obviously feel like people are dying, but what can we do from England? The Barnet Green Party's tried to stay out of it. It has come up in our recent canvassing, and we've said we support a ceasefire, and they've said, great, never voting Labour again, with you now. And that is why I think it's fantastic that we have Peter Allen joining us, that we have new councillors, we have, and I think we won this motion, and we won a ceasefire, temporary truce. We showed that we can win. And in the end, there will be a ceasefire. In the end, when everyone is dead or whatever, we will bring a better world. Now, I very much hope when Netanyahu goes after the war, he's a sitting duck in my view. But he has to stay for cosmetic purposes, not to give Hamas a win. But will it be Ben Gvir? Netanyahu he's like a Tory, how I explained to you guys. Ben Gvir is like a bit more fascist. And what can we do here? The genocidal rhetoric, I've found examples in UK print media, and that's where we can challenge it, because to be honest, international law doesn't apply in Israel. There are some countries, USA, which are above certain conventions. I also wanted to say about the hope. No, I've already mentioned that. The Israel Green Party, non-starter, really tiny. It's a bit tricky. We want the Palestine Green Party too, also tiny. They won't really talk to us as long as we support BDS. The other campaign wins I'd like to talk about are SodaStream in Brighton. It's a clear win. They closed their shop. And my job in the Green Party is campaigns. It's not about rhetoric. It's about winning. So come to campaigns committee, say, can we recognise your group officially as a Green Party campaign group? That's what we're here for. Constitutionally, that's the proper channels to go. Because frankly, we're campaigning on banning advertising or whatever, but there's potential. If you want us to support your local parties and your campaigns, then we can.
Thank you, Ben. So we've had, I think, 5 contributions since our speakers concluded. We've heard from Faiz, from Les, from Roy, from Paul, and from Ben. So I'm going to give the speakers the opportunity to come back and comment on anything that they've heard, bearing in mind that Les has particularly asked that people tackle his 2 questions: what historically is the driver for the state of Israel, and what practical things, as opposed to rhetorical things, what practical things can Green Party members do to make a difference? So in a reverse order, if we can go first of all to Pete. And Pete, if you could just confine your remarks to 2 or 3 minutes, I think that would be good. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm on. Yeah. I just need to come back about this, about well, in response to the question about what drives the Israelis, what drives their state, what drives their, what is their ideology? I think it's nationalism, and it perhaps in many cases an extreme form of nationalism. And I have to disagree with the view that it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. It's intrinsically the growth of Israel and the aggressive nature of Israel, the aggressive stance that Israel has taken to any threats to its security, as in my opinion, is very closely related to the experiences of the Jewish people. And if people don't agree with me, then that's fine. But that's well, it's not fine, but then I'll have to accept that. But I feel that very, very strongly. In terms of what we can do practically, actually, I think the key players are the Americans, aren't they? And anything that we can do to support those people, putting pressure on the Americans, who can actually make Israel shift, is the key to it. And I'm encouraged by the amount of opposition that there is to Biden's stance amongst certain sections of the American public, particularly amongst young people, as is true across the world, of course. And I note that in Michigan, where there's a strong Arab population, the Democrats and Biden's re-election campaign are very worried that actually the Arab vote in the state of Michigan, which is one of the key states, is actually going to desert Biden, and it could possibly cost him the election, and then we'd have Trump, and we don't want that, do we? But so I don't know. I think the best thing, I think the focus should be on supporting the demand that the Americans do far more to rein in the Netanyahu government, and it's the Americans who have the scope to do that more than anybody. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Pete. And moving on, we come back to Alexi. Alexi, your 2-3 minutes to address any of the points raised and the questions raised.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think there's been some really good points made by all the speakers. Yeah, I definitely agree with what Faiz was saying in terms of how we should treat people that are going to fight for the IDF, for example. I mean, I don't think that we should allow people to go and fight for an army and be complicit into the atrocities that are going on. And I think we should treat that as we would if it was any other nationality. And as I also agree with the things that Paul was saying in terms of Les's comments. What is the driver for the Israeli government? I mean, I agree. It's nationalism, or more supremacism. Really, it's a supremacist ideology. And I think it's political Zionism really is a European idea. It's a European disease of nationalism, and it's not different from other colonialist or colonial ideologies in terms of that. But I think that it is right that they exploit the Holocaust. They exploit the really genuine and justified fear of people and victims of the Holocaust, and they also exploit the guilt of Europeans. But again, I think anti-Semitism is really historically a European disease as well, maybe linked to Christianity. During pogroms, going back even as far as, the reconquest of Spain, Jewish victims of pogroms fled to the Ottoman Empire, for example. So, I think all of the roots of this conflict is from Europe, and unfortunately, it's Palestinian people and still Jewish people that are, that are feeling the pressure and the violence, and really, it is up to us to try and find a way forward. And this does mean putting pressure on the Americans and also the British, and calling out the complicity and the actual fueling of these atrocities. The fact that we have allowed this status quo to exist for such a long time, allowed this system of apartheid to develop unchallenged and being cemented, ethnic cleansing. This is only a continuation of that. I mean, before October the 7th, I'm sure many of you have seen Netanyahu go to the UN with a map of Israel where there weren't any Palestinian territories. So this is something that, has been a clear aim of his government. And I think, it's well documented that Netanyahu actually supported Hamas as a bloc on Palestinian statehood, because he said you could not negotiate with Hamas, so we should support Hamas continuing, so we won't have to negotiate with them. And this is what has led to the situation we are in now. I think what can we do as well as councillors and as Green Party members? I think we should support blockades of Elbit systems and support BDS. We should. I mean, I'm also on the South Yorkshire Pensions Authority, which unfortunately still has, as do all local government pension schemes, to my knowledge, shares not only in arms companies but also in fossil fuel companies such as BP and Shell, which are fueling not only the climate crisis, but in the case of BP, they've been buying up gas exploration licenses off the coast of Gaza. So our councils as well, Sheffield Council banks with Barclays, which is complicit in both fossil fuel extraction and, of course, investments in arms companies, especially those involved in the Israeli occupation and apartheid system. And also HP. I'm sure the laptop I'm using now, council laptop, is supplied by HP. HP well documented links to apartheid, and so we need to be calling out council procurement practices. We need to be calling out our pensions authorities, and we also need to be really clear about saying that we want to see all the war crimes, including those committed on October the 7th. And since be dealt with by the International Criminal Court. There's very little prospect of that. But people like Netanyahu, we should really be calling for the expulsion of the Israeli ambassador, and even condemning America and of course our own government's complicity.
Okay, thank you, Alexi. And continuing in reverse order, we turn now to Carne. Carne, you have a few minutes to address any of the points that you've heard from the floor contributions a little earlier.
Thanks. Lots of really good points made. I've been trying to note them. I've shared my email address, or Peter has shared my email address. Please do feel free to write to me if you have suggestions of what the party should be saying about particular issues. I noted Faiz's suggestions, for instance, about the behaviour of settlers, that we ought to be calling on Prevent to monitor violent settlers, that we ought to be saying something about the stifling of discussion at universities and schools, do please jot down these points when they occur to you and send me an email. I would really appreciate it. I think it's important that we broaden our posture as a party to beyond just calls for a ceasefire. The call for a ceasefire is incredibly important, and of course is a central pillar of our response to the horrific violence in Gaza. But I think there are other things we should be saying as well. So I noted also the support for us to reaffirm our support for the BDS movement. That too, I think, is something we could be saying at a leadership level now that would reinforce our position on the ceasefire. A quick couple of comments in answer to Les's questions. I'm, to be honest, less interested in why Israel does what it does and more interested in actually what they're doing in terms of the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem. And to me, that is what we need to respond to, not least because the framing of international law around those issues is so clear. I think international law is a very strong rock for us to stand on in terms of its very clear demands for the end of occupation and solution to the issue of a just solution to the issue of Jerusalem and Palestinian refugees. I dare say also that there is complete agreement amongst member states of the UN on the two-state solution rather than a one-state solution. I am myself agnostic about which solution we should promote, and believe that if the parties can agree to one or the other, then we shouldn't take a predetermined view on it. On the other hand, there is not one country in the world that talks about a one-state solution, and I think we have to respond to that realism, and also reflect on the fact that the two-state solution has been called for very clearly by the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, and others, and that is a important basis for our position. Finally, a quick point on genocide that's been mentioned by some. We have not called Israeli actions genocide. We have discussed that in the leadership group. We decided against naming what Israel is doing as genocide. That doesn't mean we won't in the future. But if you feel strongly about this, do please write to me. I think Alexi mentioned an article on genocide by a scholar on the topic. Do please send me the link to that article or post it in the chat, and I will have a look at it. I'm always interested in articles of that nature. This is a moving target, and I want us to keep on top of it. And as I say, I'm always open to your inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carne. And then finally for this round, we come back to Annie. Annie, would you like to pick up any of the points you've heard?
The main one, I really welcome the response from the other panel members. I think there's sort of interesting things coming up, and particularly what Faiz suggested. I hope we can pursue those. But I just want to focus a moment on what Les asked about what we can practically do, because what we haven't talked about is the anti-boycott bill that's currently going through Parliament and which is coming up for its third reading. Caroline Lucas spoke very strongly against it. It's a bill which exempts Israel from all boycotts in perpetuity, Israel by name, and that's a complete nonsense given the behaviour of Israel at the moment, as ever. That we need to be campaigning against that, I think, both through our elected representatives in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons, but also I think at council, local council level, where a previous attempt by a government to do this was treated with contempt by a banding together of different councils. And I think if we could encourage local councils to contact each other, and that there was a group response to this from local councils pointing out the iniquities of it. So that's one thing. The other thing about what we can do practically, I think the blockades that Les mentioned, of the arms bases, arms factories, which have been going on just in the last couple of weeks, that they are led by, this is the eco-socialist point really, they're being led by workers and trade unions. That's specifically the basis of those blockades. And I think it would be great if there was Green Party presence on that, clearly, strongly, Green Party banners showing where we stand. And just, I think the ideas of exploring what Fi's suggested, it would be great if Carne picks them up and we begin to work out what you have to do to expel the Israeli ambassador, or what you have to do to prosecute for war crimes, to sanction people. Yeah, those are my suggestions on what we can do, and I really think it's what we can practically do that really so much matters at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Annie. It is now exactly 8:30 according to my laptop, and therefore I think we have time probably for one more fairly brief round of questions and floor contributions, and then a quick sort of set of closing statements from the speakers, potentially addressing any of the questions or points that come up in this next round. So already I have hands from Jim McGinley and Anne Gray. I'll probably take 3 or 4 contributions if we can keep them brief. As always, please, folks, that would be great. But let's not waste any more time. Let's go straight to Jim McGinley. Jim, please.
Yes, just briefly, I think, as I understand it, the two-state solution is not ever going to come into being. The Israelis have made sure of that. From the conclusion of what's called the Oslo Accords, they systematically made it impossible for a viable state ever to come into existence. Netanyahu has made it his life's mission. And I think that a single democratic state is the political goal that should be supported as the only thing that will ever dismantle the settler state and its matrix of control. It's hugely oppressive and very detailed and long worked out system of oppression and dispossession and eventually ethnic cleansing. Those who support a single democratic state solution point to, as a way of getting there, the example of South Africa. The support for Palestinians worldwide has been described as equal to the worldwide support there was for the anti-apartheid movement. And the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa wasn't brought about by agreement from the oppressing whites. It was brought about by international pressure and, of course, the resistance and active opposition from the black population. That is the pattern, I think, the only way in which this situation with Israel and its settler colonialism approach, and it doesn't really matter, I agree, you know, whether the Holocaust is behind that. What they're doing has always been unacceptable. And I think that we need to see, I would push for the Green Party to put forward the single state solution, because in other words, a viable, possible, feasible solution rather than the two-state solution, which isn't really a possibility. And we need that, because otherwise all the things that we're advocating and supporting are means of resistance, simply a resistance against oppression on the basis of human rights. And that's not a framework to liberate the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was very clear. I see one, Jim, if you could pop your hand down when you get a chance. And I'm going to go now to Anne Gray. And Anne, is it possible for you to put your camera on so that we can see you whilst you speak, in case anyone with hearing impairment needs that clue? Thank you.
Thank you. I want to take issue with the Green Party's leadership on the issue of calling out genocide. I think so many other pro-Palestinian forces have in our country said this is genocide. It needs to be recognized as such. That is a whole new departure in the way that we look at this conflict, because it hasn't been said widely before. And I think it's really important now to say that the deaths of over 18,000 people now, supposedly to root out Hamas from underground tunnels, you know, this is going beyond any sort of reasonable self-defense, and it definitely is genocide. Loads of people are saying that. Why are we not saying it? I don't think an adequate explanation has been given. Secondly, on the issue of what to do about British passport holders who are engaging with the Israeli army, and worse still, if they are joining in violent actions of the settlers in the West Bank who've done things like demolished whole villages. If these people are British passport holders, I would look not to prevent, which I think we should be opposing as an internal UK measure on every possible front. Prevent is a bad program. It's very Islamophobic. It needs to be opposed. Let's not do it through prevent. Let's just charge these people with crimes of violence and treat them similarly as to the people who went to fight for ISIS in Syria. There was a handful of those. We know what to do with them. So please don't talk about prevent. Do the sort of things that, about the only decent thing my local MP, David Lammy, has done was to call for settlers who have non-UK passports and have been guilty of violence in the West Bank to be simply refused entry to the country. This is definitely something we should be calling for. So please, genocide as a label for the awful things that are happening is really, really important. And the last thing I want to ask is, why is the Green Party not mobilizing for demonstrations? Why is it not being public in doing stuff? The field is being given to the Socialist Workers' Party and its lookalikes. There will be a tremendous split in the Labour Party on the issue of Palestine. Why are we not taking advantage of this? Why are the Greens not coming forward and saying we are the alternative? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And I'm scanning my Zoom screen here, and I can see no more hands, which means that potentially we've got to the point where I've got Martin. So Martin, perhaps yours will be the last contribution. If you take 2 or 3 minutes, and then we shall revert to our speakers once again. And let me just, in fairness to them, decide in advance a running order. So what I shall do, I think I shall go for Carne first, and Pete second, and Annie third, and Alexi fourth, after Martin has had an opportunity to speak. So Martin, 2 or 3 minutes, over to you.
Yeah, I'm a secretary of a local Palestine Solidarity campaign here in Brent and Harrow, and I go to officers' meetings every week of officers throughout the country, and we have discussed some of these things in some detail, particularly the issue of genocide. At first, PSC was very reluctant to call it genocide. They used phrases like moving towards or preparing the ground for, etc. But now, with various international definitions of what genocide is, and taking into account the statements of politicians and army commanders in Israel, they are beginning to call it genocide. One, I think, of the most powerful things that slogans that's coming out on the various demonstrations is, it didn't start on October the 7th, the importance of contextualizing the violence in the Middle East and what's been going on and what's been set up both in terms of the West Bank, a settler violence, building of settlers, taking away of land, taking away homes, demolishing homes, the system of apartheid that operates in many different ways throughout. One of the most important ones, I think, is child prisoners. So I think when the Green Party is talking about these issues, that just calling for a ceasefire, which looks like it's going to leave things as they are, which is a country in ruins, siege still in place and so on, isn't sufficient. What we should be doing is talking about the conditions that are needed to start the process towards a just solution, which would mean the wall coming down, dismantling of apartheid system, not the use of military courts for children under 16, and so on, and perhaps we should prepare the ground in the International Committee, prepare positions in advance of the way things look like they're moving. So particularly something like the Rafah crossing, when on the demonstrations there are banners calling for the opening of the crossing so that Gazans can freely move into Egypt. Egypt is reluctant. But there's also the whole issue that by doing so, we have a second Nakba, where Gazans become refugees in neighbouring countries, particularly in Egypt, because of the geography. Others are saying if you do that, then you are handing Gaza over to the Israeli government. I also take the point that's been made earlier about looking at some of the other motivations, and I think the gas fields off the coast that at the moment the Palestinians are not able to exploit, that given the present world situation, that the Israelis have an economic interest in sequestering those gas fields. And we should, as environmentalists, have something to say about gas fields themselves, but also the morality of, as well as taking the land and taking the water, they're now taking the sea.
Thank you very much, Martin, and an admirably clear final contribution from the floor there. So it is now 8:43. I think probably now is an ideal opportunity for us to revert to our speakers, to give each of them 2 or 3 minutes to perhaps make any closing remarks or to reflect on any of the points or questions that we've just heard from our 4 contributors in that last round, before we wind up, and we ought to succeed in closing before 9 o'clock. So I said before that we would go in order: Carne, Pete, Annie and Alexi. So let me invite Carne to come forward and make a few closing remarks. Carne, please.
Thank you. I don't have a lot to say, except thanks for having me, and thanks for the many comments that have been made in this discussion, which are very well made and helpful to me as we consider the party's position going forward through this crisis, and to reiterate that my door is open. If you feel that we need to be saying something that we're not, or you disagree with what we are saying, please do put pen to paper and write to me, and I will do my best to reflect those points in the leadership discussions that we have on a continual basis. There's a WhatsApp group that more or less runs continuously through this. I will think about the genocide points that have been made. I will try to reflect that to the leadership and reflect the arguments carefully on either side of that. And Gray made the point about why are we not out there calling for demonstrations? You know, why are we leaving the field to the socialist workers and others? I don't have a necessarily direct answer to that. All I would say is that when we've been approached by the march organisers for the big London marches, we've always done our best to provide a speaker for those, and indeed have spoken at those demonstrations on a fairly consistent basis. So I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much indeed. And we move on now to Pete. 2 or 3 minutes, Pete, please, to wind up.
Yeah, well, just a couple of things. I'd certainly very much like to agree with Anne's point about actually in terms of 2-state solutions or 1-state solutions, it's actually not for us to choose. It's for the people of Israel, Palestine coming out of negotiations. But I would also observe, as I think other speakers have mentioned, how much more difficult it is to envisage a 2-state solution at the moment. When that was kind of on the table, or at least being hinted at, or at least talking about, at least being raised in the early stages of what were assumed to be ongoing and protracted negotiations, the Oslo Accords, etc., etc. At that time, there was something. There were a few tens of thousands of settlers in the West Bank, and now I understand there are 700,000. So it does make it very difficult to envisage quite how a 2-state solution would work. And I think the whole thing is very difficult and very complicated. I want to also go back. I also want to raise the point that Martin made about the Rafah crossing, because I think however much people might think it plays into the hands of the Israelis, who possibly want to depopulate Gaza, and I think there's quite a lot of evidence that the Netanyahu regime have an interest in depopulating Gaza. Actually, on a humanitarian level, it's clearly got to be a demand that we should that would appear to me to be reasonable and possibly essential, that the Egyptians open the Rafah crossing so that people who want to escape the horror, the hellhole of Gaza have the ability to do so. Although, of course, it might then lead to the Israelis putting a stop to that. Okay, but look, the real point I want to make is, I suppose the most essential point I want to make is, we need to think about the ecological crisis. Okay, Gaia's book, which I would strongly recommend that people take a look at, and which I'm going to send a link to, makes the point that actually the whole of the Middle East is going to be uninhabitable by the year 2100, as is the whole global South. So we actually do need our essential task, our most important task. The reason why I've decided to get involved in the International Committee is to build a movement for a worldwide movement for effective climate change mitigation and a new world, really, a new eco-socialist world. It's a massive task, but actually therein lies the solution to the problem of the Middle East and elsewhere. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pete. And of course, it does cause us to reflect that, just now there's the psychodrama going on in Westminster over flights to Rwanda. And when you think about the whole of the global South being uninhabitable in a very short number of years, you begin to appreciate the complete mismatch between government thinking and the scale of the problem. However, we digress. Next, please, Annie. A couple of minutes to wind up, please, Annie.
Yeah, I'd just like to stress the enormity of the shift in public awareness and interest in what's going on in Palestine and Israel that's happened in this country, that the Green Party really does need to be part of that. I think we can be much bolder. Anne talked about the use of the word genocide. I know that in the past, the Green Party has been very reluctant to use the word apartheid even. I think we've got to move into much more bold, clear describing of the situation. I think that will help mobilise, bring in our membership, involve our membership. Faiz, I see, has just suggested having banners at the London demonstrations. I think we can do that at our local demonstrations. My question really is to everybody here and the membership as a whole, how we mobilise, how we coordinate. Martin's talked about being in the PSC. I'm finding it much easier to organise through local Palestine solidarity groups than I am through the Green Party around this. That's where the energy is. And I think that's really sad. And I would like us to find ways of bringing it into the Green Party and mobilising an interested, involved membership. And I think what Carne is suggesting is really good. If we can find ways of seeding, what's the word? Weaving, I don't know what the word is, getting what's happening in those WhatsApp meetings of the leadership down through the membership, so the back and forth is happening and we build a coherent political response.
Thank you, Annie. And certainly I think our experience is that many of us in our local parties are participating in local rallies. We're taking our local Green Party flags down to marches and demonstrations in London, but it's all happening from the ground up. Historically, there have been a few cases when Green Party participation in national demonstrations was orchestrated from the centre, when announcements would go out via Action Network to the whole membership announcing where the Green Bloc would be, when it would assemble, making materials available for members to take along with them, encouraging people to join together, in addition to making speakers available for rallies and things. And I think that kind of thing falls somewhere between the communications team, which of course is made up principally of paid professional members or employees of the Green Party, and arguably the campaigns committee, and Ben has spoken about that earlier, which historically doesn't just accredit, I think, particular groups as campaign groups, but also takes a role in coordinating major Green Party campaigns. Finally then, I think we come to the fourth of our speakers this evening for some closing remarks. So I'll hand over for a couple of minutes, please, to Alexi.
Thanks very much, Danny. So I've got a few things to say. I mean, firstly, you know, on a personal level, I have family from Cyprus, which is an island that has been divided by both nationalism and imperialism. And I just talking about the two-state solution, I can't think of anywhere in the world where really partition has led to a just and lasting peace. It's led to a lot of cold wars and nuclear armed cold wars and conflicts, and a lot of hot wars and contested things. And I'd like to point to the example of South Africa that some of people have mentioned previously. And we, as somebody that I would describe myself as anti-nationalist, I really want to believe in a world where everyone can live together and not be separated along lines of nationality, ethnicity, or religion, or any other. I think we all should be live together in tolerant, inclusive, and diverse societies. Secondly, to Anne's point, I think in Sheffield we have taken a lead, and I think we could do more so nationally. I mean, I think it is also okay to be part of PSC or other organisations that are taking a lead as well, and standing alongside people as well. What I'm also really concerned about in this current conflict is the real undermining of international law, sort of the ending the post-war, post-Second World War international order. And I think that, well, really the Iraq War kind of destroyed the authority of the UN, and now we've just seen that, even the Genocide Convention, or the Americans don't recognize the International Criminal Court, but we're just seeing all of the norms of international law being upended in this conflict, and never again will the West be able to take the moral high ground about anything. And also to talk about Rwanda, I mean, we've got the Tories and Labour jumping over each other to abolish the Refugee Convention, and I think this is all part of really worrying process that we need to be really raising the alarm about as the Green Party, and saying that we support the international law and institutions like the UN, and that they should actually have real power Of course, abolishing vetoes and the Security Council would be a good step. In terms of what Green Party can do, I'd like to see more platforms for Palestinian people, Palestinian voices at meetings like this. There are some Green with, a small G Palestinian activists that have been raising the alarm about the environmental impact of the occupation. I mean, there was a period where they were putting raw sewage into Gaza. And then, of course, there's the well-documented, setting fire to or confiscating Palestinian olive trees and separating farmers from their land. And then finally, what would be really useful is working through the LGA, working on a divestment toolkit for councillors and councillors that are on pensions authorities, and maybe circulating model motions as well that we could pass. And yeah, we need to really oppose that BDS bill, because the anti-BDS bill is already having a chilling effect. When I talked about divesting from companies complicit in war crimes, the head of the South Yorkshire Pensions Authority said, well, we have to be really careful about this because of the anti-BDS bill, and that is not even law yet. I mean, and it might not be, but I don't know whether Keir Starmer would pursue it. Depends how quickly we have an election. But yeah, I think support for councillors and activists and people on how to put forward model motions and a toolkit for divestment would be really useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexi. And your remarks in conjunction with Pete's earlier remarks make me think that perhaps next year, one of the future meetings in this series ought to try to tackle this bigger question about global demographic shifts that will take place in the next 25, 50, 75 years as the climate changes, because that possibly is one of the biggest issues that governments will have to deal with. Ben says shortage of funds for gazebos and flags, etc. And it's absolutely true for the moment. But of course, the budget for the campaigns committee, as the budget indeed for everything, is set ultimately by GPEX and by the financial controller. Those people are elected by us and respond to the priorities that we set. Green Left has long campaigned through conference and other bodies for more clarity and transparency in the budget management process, and for greater priority for expenditure on genuine street campaigns. And I think what's happening in Gaza just now is an excellent illustration of the need for more pressure from members on the leadership, on GPEX, on GPRC, for greater priority, greater funding for genuine street campaigns to raise our profile and improve our electoral prospects. Anyway, we've been Green Left. If you're interested in more, some contact details will be posted in the chat now. It only remains for me to thank, first of all, our speakers, and we truly are indebted to 4 people who have taken the time out to research and prepare some remarks and come along and address us here slap bang in the middle of December, which is possibly not when people want to be spending their evenings doing this, but we are in their debt for doing that for us, and greatly appreciated. And finally, thank you very much indeed to all of you. I'm just looking on the chat to see if our contact details for Green Left are going to appear. Thank you to all of you for coming along and spending this evening with us, and for your contributions to the discussion. And let's hope we take these things back to our local parties, back to our regions, and we keep the pressure on internally within the Green Party, and we keep working through our local parties with our local Palestine Solidarity Campaign organisations and others in our streets and on our communities. So please do pick up the links to Green Left. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and we look forward to seeing you all at some of our future meetings in 2024, some of which are also there in the chat. Good.